Introduction?
Yeah, so welcome everyone to this panel on FOIA requests during the COVID-19 pandemic, hosted by the New England Chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. We got Michael Morisy here, the co-founder of MuckRock.com, who's an expert on this, and Chris Faraone, who's the founder of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, and it should be a great event. Hope I inspired everyone.
Thanks, Adam.
Go team.
And thanks, Jordan, for covering the governor, I guess. And I'm Chris Faraone, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. And I'm Michael. When was our first interview? I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe.
Just under 10 years ago. Chris was actually the first person to ever want to do a feature on MuckRock and would actually return my emails when no one else would.
Cool. Well, and you've always been a big help to us, so I appreciate it. And this is going to be fun. I have, my first confession, I guess, is that although some of my reporters have, I have not personally filed a FOIA yet, and we'll get into not totally. I haven't said no, I'm not going to do it. I've been busy and stuff, but I definitely want to talk about how the ecosystem has changed, and certainly I'm going to jump in tonight. But let's just start with, I want to start a little, so pretty generally, and I want to ask, sure, MuckRock is not a regular journalism institution. It's not a newspaper or anything like that. But, from where you're a nonprofit, you haven't always been, but you are now. There are other entities. Maybe you want to note, things like Document Cloud. But basically, from where you sit, what were your reactions? We were all sitting here watching our advertisers go away at the Dig, for example, and stuff like that. But I'm sure, what were your observations, and maybe what were some unique issues that you thought MuckRock was going to face? Let's go back a month.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, first of all, our main concern is just sort of what's happening in communities around the country, right? And I think, like you mentioned, the Dig this is a very challenging time for alt weeklies. This is a challenging time for newspapers of almost all stripes. And as well as almost every other news organization is deeply hurting right now, as their communities really need them the most, right? I think earlier this year, we merged with an organization based in Detroit, Outlier Media, that was really focused on information needs for particularly low-income residents of the Detroit metro area. And they have a text line where people text in, ask questions, and what you see out there is people are afraid, people are concerned about their health, about their livelihood, about what they're hearing on social media. And they had people texting in being like, hey, I read about this home-based test you can make yourself to see if you have COVID-19, or other rumors that sort of this is all a sort of a government plan, and people just are desperate for quality information. But right now you see newsrooms around the country furloughing employees, furloughing staff, or shutting down entirely, right as people are really need reliable information the most. And so I think figuring out what can we do to help news organizations that have been impacted by this, while keeping our staff safe and healthy, has been, really kind of our main focus. And I think that this is just sort of the beginning of real challenges for news organizations around the country.
So how about for your organization? What was some strategizing that you did? Obviously, people had to go home, and I do want to ask about the paper. We'll get there, about the actual paperwork. But just general strategy. How did you triangulate? How did you really set up for? Because you knew you were. I mean, it goes without saying, you knew you were going to be busy. You didn't think you were going on vacation. So how did you prepare for that? What did you bring home with you? Stuff like that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we moved to an all remote staff on March 11th. And so because we were a fairly distributed team, we were able to kind of make that call a little bit earlier than some other folks, and, sort of reworking our practices. But, I don't know for other folks what it's been like, but this has really felt like a historical moment where things just ratchet up. Every time you go to the grocery store, it's like walking into a different world. First it's 6 feet away, then it's only so many people in the store at a time, then everybody's wearing masks, and I think from a work environment, we've tried to be supportive of our team. We've been in a fortunate situation where we can sort of give people more relaxed hours, because I think this is very challenging professionally, but also personally. We've had I think so many people are losing so many people that are close to them right now that we've tried to be really flexible. We do a lot of physical mail, so we're
Yeah,
still
well, that's my
filing.
next question. I got to hear it. So I was,
Yeah.
I was naive. I didn't realize you said this to me a couple months ago, I think, and I was like, "What? You guys do? You back everything up? So you still do
Yeah.
physical mail, the FOIA request usually every time, pretty much?"
Yeah. So if an agency accepts email requests or fax requests, we'll use those. Mail is sort of our last resort, but a lot of agencies are still very paper driven, animals in terms of sort of how they work, how they operate. And so that's been, interesting challenge.
So
So
that still happens. That's still the case.
yeah,
That's
that's
still
still
the
the
case.
case. Yeah. So
And
we're
is that
sending out.
just federal mostly? How about, are there any generalities there? Is the federal mostly electronic, and it's more municipal that is paper, or?
It has improved over the last few years. We see more agencies, but still you have a lot of federal agencies. I mean, federal agencies, they do kind of the craziest stuff, right? Where it's like they'll email you, but then they'll also still mail it certified mail, and they'll be like also send via email. So they're sending you 2 copies of everything. Which is, especially when they're sending something like an acknowledgement letter or saying like, hey, you're place 1,000 in the queue, and then they spent $10 on a certified letter to let you that. It's a little mind boggling sometimes. I think things
Have you
are,
seen any policy changes? I'm sorry. Have you seen any policy changes on the websites or stuff like that, with the situation?
yeah. So we've started to see a number of agencies start to shift their operations to remote. For the most part, a lot of I think federal agencies have been slower to sort of move to remote work. And because so much of the federal government's files are literally physical paper files, or are on systems where they're designed to be shut off from the internet for security or privacy reasons. We've seen agencies for a while, a number of agencies are kind of grinding to a halt. Other agencies, if they're able to do something remotely and they can still access those, we've seen agencies be creative and try to work with requesters as much as they can. As far as our own operations, actually, I brought home our kind of key scanner at the office, and so it's sat up right on my desk. And so at night when I'm kind of unwinding with Netflix or whatever, continuing to scan in all the paper that's coming back to us.
Wow. How about privatization? I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on it, but I know that a lot of files these days are held with third party. I run into it in Massachusetts. I know at the federal level, it's a huge issue. I hate to say it, is that something that may end up in a situation like this that's almost, dare I say, good or better? Or is it worse that if there's another person who's not home?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think we've been talking about privatization for almost a decade now, and it's continued to get worse, where agencies kind of farm out their record keeping to different private companies. And in some cases, it can be a better thing, right? Because the government's job is to kind of do government services. They're not database experts. They're not storage experts. And so if you have a good company that makes sure that they can actually comply with the law, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? And especially because agencies really have had a hard time shifting their technology from the 1970s, right? We've seen this with the unemployment websites where they're still written in COBOL. They don't scale. People are not getting the help they need because government just has not developed the expertise to kind of run these systems the way they should. And I think there's a lot of reasons that it could be a whole other discussion about why. But in the short term, sometimes these outsourcings can improve things, but a lot of times the outsourcing companies, what we've seen is that they'll say, oh, that's a trade secret, or the way we store this data is a trade secret. And so it can end up making things a lot worse even without COVID-19.
Well, all right, so let's get to some of the meat of it. Anything that really pops out is some of the more creative FOIAs that you've seen so far? Just even anything that you want to note? I remember a couple of weeks ago, I was watching a White House press briefing, and somebody pulled out something that they had gotten off of FOIA, and it was kind of not the first time I thought of it, but I was like, oh wow, okay, people are still doing this work, and I was wondering, and we'll talk about this in a few directions, but anything that pops out that to highlight or something creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of people kind of use public records to kind of fact check sort of responses, right? And I think we're seeing politicians do what politicians do, which is kind of go where they think the wind is going politically. But then sort of you're able to use public records, like, is whatever this governor is saying, is this actually based on research? Are they just listening to business and other special interests, or are they listening to the science? And so we've seen a lot of people kind of go in and ask for, okay, we want your state's Department of Health estimates of the impact of COVID-19. We want to see emails that you're getting and sort of what is going into your policy pronouncements. And I think when you're able to kind of file targeted requests for sort of documents that are sort of breaking news related, it's hard for them to argue that those documents are not accessible if they're already working with those documents in sort of a distributed way.
Right.
We're also seeing a lot of really interesting requests sort of looking at how our policies being implemented, right? So we've done a lot of stuff around sort of like looking at sort of prisons and how are they sort of adapting to social distancing recommendations. Are they actually keeping their inmates safe? Are they keeping their staff safe? And being able to sort of say, hey, I want any policy updates over the past week can be a really effective request to kind of dig into these institutions that are not doing a whole lot of public discussion about their work.
Yeah, or even actual planning. Does it exist? Is there an actual plan? That's like, right.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is there? And I know this stuff is like different everywhere, but generally speaking, if possible, what is being returned? What isn't? Is there more of a trend like that? Federal has been more responsive, whereas nobody's home at city halls, or I don't know, a couple maybe specific examples. But I'm wondering, for me, and I want to talk more about this, and I guess I'll combine the questions. Not that I necessarily feel bad about bothering the bureaucrat at Milford or whatever town hall, but are they even there? Are there whole kinds of FOIA requests that you're seeing, that you're really not getting anything on?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I think agencies, I think there was a few weeks where agencies said, look, we're reinventing our agency. And I honestly, I think in a lot of cases that's understandable. And agencies, I think the best practice was if your agency is having to move all remote, if you're trying to have to think everything from scratch, which a lot of agencies genuinely did, I think it's reasonable for agencies to say it's going to take us a couple extra weeks. We have seen some agencies that are triaging requests to an extent where they say, hey, does this have sort of an immediate public interest in disclosure? Then we're going to prioritize that. And I think that can be a good thing as long as it's done in a truly sort of agnostic way in terms of who the requester is, or sort of there's not political favoritism being happened. And so I think in some really challenging circumstances, I think, the vast majority of public information officers are handling this well. Then we've seen other agencies that, have made some really baffling decisions, right? So for a while, the FBI, for example, made a big deal, put up this FOIA portal about a couple years ago. And then during the COVID-19 crisis, they said, hey, as a response to the COVID-19 crisis, we're shutting down our FOIA portal. We will no longer accept requests through it. You have to mail in your requests, right? And that's such a baffling thing. It's hard to imagine that it was done maliciously, but the result is you're asking people to put themselves and your own staff in more danger as a response to this crisis. And so we've seen some weird stuff like that. And I think some agencies that are predisposed not to being good at handling public records requests are using this as an excuse to kind of just not accept them at all. And we have seen some agencies, I think a number of agencies in New Jersey and Illinois that have simply said, hey, during the state of emergency, we're no longer accepting requests. And I think that's
reporters just reporting that. I mean,
they are, yeah. And we've seen a lot of times after outcry, So the city of Chicago, within 24 hours after being called out on it, sort of reversed policy and said, we will continue to process these. And so I think when agencies sort of say, hey, look, we need extra time, or hey, not everything is going to be accessible, I think most requesters really do understand that and empathize with that. When agencies put out a blanket statement that says we're not going to process any requests, I think the public has a lot of really good questions and a right to sort of say that's not okay. So flexibility, I think that's something we should all embrace right now. Using this out of get out of jail card, I think that's where we can push back.
Well, speaking of areas where there's not too much sunlight, I know there's people probably watching from elsewhere, but we're in Massachusetts here, and as Jordan started this meeting out, showing, he's covering the State House, he's covering Charlie Baker. For those who don't know, we basically have very little public information availability on all of Beacon Hill, from the legislature to the executive branch. So, it's actually almost, we stand out as particularly bad on that front. I'm not going to beat around the bush. So, anything that you've seen on the Massachusetts front, any tips, for me too. This is really something that's happening. And sure, the municipalities are important and we see what's happening there, but the state, that's where the action is. How do we get in there using FOIA, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is really unfortunate that the Baker administration has continued the practice of sort of claiming that they're exempt. It's also baffling to me that we haven't had a law firm kind of make a concerted effort to kind of settle that, because this is still unsettled law in Massachusetts, which I think also, says something about the broader transparency culture here. But I do think there's ways to kind of be creative, right? I think there's ways to sort of look at, right? I think with a crisis of this magnitude, it's always going to be an interagency response. It's always going to be a response that involves multiple different officials and stuff like this multi-state New England compact for like the coronavirus opening, right? So those are my kind of favorite situations where you have different jurisdictions kind of working together on something. And that means you can file requests with all those different states for the materials, for their discussions. And if 3 out of 4 states, 3 out of 5 states reject something, you still can get material. And then you also have the opportunity to then say, hey, this is what the Baker administration didn't want you to see because they denied that request. And so I think looking for opportunities, looking where agencies intersect, whether that's different state agencies within Massachusetts, Massachusetts with other agencies, or Massachusetts with federal, right? There's a lot of coordination, and there's a lot of games that the federal government is playing, obviously, with doling out relief, with doling out supplies. And I think that's going to be years and years to kind of unwind everything that's gone wrong over the past 3 months.
I think that's a great way to think about it, because really they're just the politicians. Everything really is happening through an agency, and that includes purchasing. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is stuff we need, whether it's ventilators and PPE, but there's still purchasing happening, and that stuff is somewhat transparent. So speaking of Massachusetts, I'll get off it soon, but right around the beginning of this, of course, I don't go around just handing out compliments to the Globe too much, but thanks to their efforts and efforts of many others, of course, it was major public records win, information win in Massachusetts regarding police records. Any update that you want to give us on that, and maybe show us where those chips may fall? And hey, the coronavirus is the story now, but that doesn't mean people aren't, couldn't be looking for other things too. So, help fill us in about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still trying to sort of assess the impact there, but I think it just goes to show you that in Massachusetts, it really requires a long-term commitment to sort of litigation and following up on that litigation.
Money, yeah.
It's really the lack of sort of the Secretary of State and the Attorney General for sort of expecting better of agencies, I think has just kind of led to one of the most miserable transparency cultures in Massachusetts. I think that does change with litigation. One thing I haven't heard is that, the thing that we've seen in every other state that kind of leads to long-lasting reforms, that leads to agencies actually changing their behavior, is requesters being awarded attorney's fees. Because a lot of this litigation that the Globe is doing and other outlets are doing, it takes years, and in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees could be awarded. Um, I, I haven't been able to check in on that recently, but last I heard, nobody who's been successful with a lawsuit has been awarded attorney's fees. I might have missed something. I hope I've missed something, because once an agency starts getting hit for 10, 20, $50,000, that's when they say, okay, maybe we should hire somebody to actually handle public records properly.
Excellent. One of the, to go more national, I guess, for a moment, one of the big stories that I believe came up for your request was the Nation story regarding U.S. military intelligence on coronaviruses, older stuff. And I wasn't going to ask you about that specifically, but I was wondering, for me as a reporter, and anybody who's watching this should really try this. And anytime I'm writing on anything, I go to Document Cloud and just type in the keywords there first. That stuff that's not going to always pop on Google. It's just, maybe somebody else, something was in the pile. Have you found, this extensive document archive, things like that, going through it? Have you found anything? Has anybody pointed anything out to you? Obviously this came out of nowhere, but it didn't come out of nowhere. There have been other crises. Maybe it's regarding Ebola, but, research-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I think as this has come up again and again, where prior administrations prepared for a pandemic. There was a playbook written by the previous administration that was handed to this administration. And that was, we filed a lot of FOIA requests for transition materials, as did a number of other news outlets. And a lot of that material is kind of hiding out in the open. And so when officials come out and say, nobody could have predicted this, whether it's on Document Cloud or elsewhere, it's very easy to see that actually for decades, people have been predicting exactly this. This is why we had a lot of the crisis response programs we had. I think after the swine flu, there was a lot of saying, like, we need to get ready. This wasn't as bad as it could have been, but I think being able to, and part of what our goal with MuckRock has always been was sort of preserving historical record. And that's why we were really excited to merge with Document Cloud a few years ago, is because we now have 100 million pages of sort of previously released primary source materials, which are helpful in the moment reporting, but also for this retrospective work, right? I think too much stuff gets lost in the memory hole, and especially as newsrooms get shrunk, being able to kind of go back and sort of see those primary source materials and see, actually, we did have a playbook. How well are we kind of managing against what we thought we were going to do? These are questions that we can find answers to, and that you don't have to rely on a self-interested politician to kind of tell you what's happening.
Cool, and it's tangential, but I've heard a little bit about really reporters using the Internet Archive too, because a lot of the municipalities not have with their safety plans, their emergency plans, some people are taking them down, stuff like that. And that's also some stuff that I'm sure you'll find elements of in the trove. This is a little bit of a tough question, but I'll put it to you anyway. At the national level, the American public broadly, is there anything regarding coronavirus, and we may have spoken about a few of these, that that people basically know from FOIA requests, from digging, that we're talking about this at an investigative journalism level, but there are things that people end up just kind of knowing, and that we almost take for granted, that came from this kind of digging and stuff that you're seeing?
That is a really good question. So I think, I think being able to kind of look at epidemic plans, both at the federal level as well as the local level, right? I think everybody knew about the CDC's sort of zombie apocalypse sort of role play, where they were, which was a goofy thing, but that was sort of used to kind of prepare agencies for this sort of thing. And so I think there is a lot of ambient understanding about sort of what are the response plans in place, sort of who is supposed to be taking charge here. But then I also think there's a lot of lessons to be seen in sort of like, because of public records, because of Freedom of Information Act requests, we're able to see expenditures, right? We're able to sort of track, especially when money is being spent. Like, that's generally something that conservatives and liberals can both agree that if taxpayer money is being spent, we have a right to see who's getting spent with. And so you're seeing very quickly things like in New York City, where a de Blasio donor got back a big sort of N95 respirator contract, even though they've never made respirators before, right? And so I think, you know, being able to kind of track that stuff in real time, that's due to sort of public records, open databases, and that sort of thing that are making it so that you don't have to kind of wait till the end of this crisis to be able to track these contracts. One of the really worrying things is that during the 2008 recovery, a lot of this information was posted proactively online. I had a lot of critiques, as did other people, about how granular that data was and how useful that was for oversight. But this administration really, really pushed not to have a resource like recovery.gov put up for the post-coronavirus world, or even the current coronavirus world. We had infrastructure to sort of make major bailouts like this transparent, open, and more equitable, quite frankly. And this administration and the legislature worked really, really hard to make sure that we didn't have that kind of transparency, as flawed as it was, for this recovery. And I think that I think is just a really amazing case study, where it's like this would have made things more efficient. This would have made things more fair. It would have made fraud harder. And they decided not to go in that direction.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's the move in the other direction. This is a crazy question, I guess, and I don't know who knows the answer, or if there is an answer. Maybe I'm just being nuts. And we could ask friends, I guess, from the globe. But do the bigs, do the New York Times, the Washington Post of the world, do they have a special FOIA window, particularly in times like this? Obviously, if you know someone, maybe they can help. But are there better? I mean, and of course, I've heard the same frustrations that we all have from people at those kinds of publications. But it like I told you earlier, it does blow my mind sometimes, and I think it's amazing that people are working in this kind of tight time frame and doing this kind of work. But yeah, when I see somebody at the White House press briefing and they're like, hold up a FOIA that they filed a couple days before, I'm not screaming special treatment. I think it's great. We could all use that information. But have you seen anything like that? Not just now, but maybe any times like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the principles of FOIA is supposed to be that it doesn't matter who you are; it's supposed to matter what you request. And there is some nuance there, right? But I think particularly there was some of this in the last two administrations where if the New York Times sent in a request, it got kicked up for special review. And sometimes that can mean a quicker response, and sometimes that could mean a more redacted response. And so we've seen that cut both ways, where yes, a lot of FOIA offices, if they get a request from the New York Times, if you're in Massachusetts, if they get a request from the Globe versus the local paper, sometimes those are handled very differently. But it cuts both ways. I've talked to a lot of sort of municipal clerks within Massachusetts who said, if a local paper or somebody who lives within our community files a request, I'm going to give that to them free. If the Globe files that request, I'm going to charge them every nickel I can, because they're not taxpayers here. And so you see it cut both ways. And so I think the main thing is focusing on what you can control, which is filing sort of very specific requests, coming in and asking for things that they're going to be able to locate more quickly, making sure you're staying out of the complex queue, and just building that muscle, right? Because I think you become a better public records requester the more you stick with it, the more you kind of pay attention to sort of what does and doesn't work. Avoiding requests like, I want any and all documents about the coronavirus. Like that's a really challenging request, but I'm sure agencies around the country are getting that. Right. It's better to sort of say, hey, I want copies of any presentations given by Massachusetts to this multi-state collaborative or whatever, and figuring out how do you ask for specific documents versus targeting categories of records.
Interesting. I just got a couple more for you. What are you seeing? Are you seeing any concessions asked for? So we were just talking about, say, local clerks. They're represented by the Mass Municipal Association. I'm not always a huge fan of them. I think they kind of fight against public information availability. But nevertheless, put that aside. Are you seeing groups like that, or any other groups or individuals ask for concessions? Say, in Massachusetts, say 20 days instead of 10 days. And also on the other hand side of that, and I think you started talking about this a little before. What as you're someone I look to as one of the leading experts around here for sure. What would you be okay with? What kind of what do we have to because we may end up seeing some legislation like that. Say everything goes digital. Say those paper files aren't as accessible as they were. If you've seen anything, have you seen any legislators in a crazy state say no more public information at all? Try to do something like that. What are you seeing happen on that front?
Yeah, so we actually just did a roundup, and we've been trying to keep track. I think we've seen fewer things that are sort of state by state. We have seen Florida kind of claim that broad swaths of information are exempt, which is particularly unusual for Florida, which has generally very expansive laws. But I think we're seeing more sort of individual, city by city, agency by agency, sort of saying, hey, we're not accepting requests right now, or hey, we're accepting your request, but we're not sure when we're actually going to get started on it. I haven't yet seen any legislative efforts. I think every state legislature is just kind of, really underwater with everything they need to do to kind of respond to the current crisis. On the other hand, that's exactly when some of our worst sort of exemptions sneak in, when it says, and all these, anything talk about the coronavirus relief bill will be exempt from public disclosure. So I do think that's an area we need to watch really, really carefully for in bills as they're kind of coming out and that sort of thing. So far, we haven't seen too many sort of state level negative responses. I think, do we think the agency is acting in good faith? In those cases, I think as a requester community, I think we should be trying to work with them and maybe say, hey, what can you get me now? What can you get me later? And be an understanding of that, especially at the local level, where public records officers at the local level, they wear many hats, right? You don't have many full-time PIOs in Massachusetts. You got a few, but not many. You have a lot of people who are trying to figure out, hey, our town has a balanced budget requirement and we're going to be losing a ton of our revenue because there's no alcohol sales now. And so I think there is a real challenge there. So I think trying to work with them. What I like to see is sort of a defined window of like, we're accepting your requests. I don't like it when agencies just say we're not going to accept any requests for the next 2 weeks. I think it's fine if they need to say, hey, we need to put a pause on request processing for a week or two, and then figure out how do we move forward from there. So I think it's a challenging thing, but I think looking for good faith efforts and acknowledging that. We've been trying to send out emails to agencies. We put a pause. Typically, MuckRock sort of automatically follows up with agencies every couple of weeks to make sure requests are on track. We put a pause on that temporarily just to kind of let agencies reorient themselves and figure out what they need to figure out. And I think for the most part, mail is still coming in. I'm still, we're still getting lots and lots of responses from agencies. We've probably had 70 or 80 requests filed by our users that have been completed by agencies just about the coronavirus, right? And so we're still seeing agencies around the country do the right thing, release information. And I think that's to be applauded because it's really so important right now that you have reliable information, because when you have a president who's saying, we need a rebellion, what was he calling for? Insurrection. It's
stand in my house. So
it's really tough out there, and people have questions, they have concerns, they're afraid. And the more we can do to get them sort of documented evidence, documented facts that they can rely on, that especially that answer their questions, right? Because I think there's been a lot of focus on COVID-19. There's been a lot of focus on modeling. I think there needs to be more focus on how many people who registered for unemployment are not getting it, and how long are they not going to get it? How many different labor violations are not going investigated right now? Because I think when we look at sort of COVID-19 related requests, I think there's so much there just about the virus and the response to the virus itself. But we're really looking at rolling economic crisis. We're looking at rolling homelessness crisis. What you're seeing in the homeless community here in Boston is just, it's unbelievable. And I think it's very easy for those stories to get drowned out with everything else going on.
I just have a couple. That's a great way to end it. I just want to throw a couple on there and then ask if you had anything. But funds. So, in Boston, one of the great, in my opinion, there's troubled situations, let's say, was the One Fund. After the Boston Marathon bombing, a fund, a very public-private, whatever you want to call it, a non-transparent fund was established. I don't forget how many millions went in and out of it. Very interesting thing. Some people were prosecuted for allegedly abusing it, but there was not even transparency around that. So without getting into my One Fund conspiracy theories, but we know there is a disaster relief fund now set up very similarly. And I'm sure that any state that anybody's watching from, their local city, maybe their state has similar things. Any tips? These things are obviously meant to be kept, pretty tight. They like them to be black boxes. I understand. They want to get it done. They want to get it done fast. They probably don't want the IRS in their ass and a whole bunch of things. But what do you have for people? What can you tell people who might be looking at these kinds of funds?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really great point, right? Because you do have these sort of public-private partnerships. And depending on the state, some states are better where if you're spending public funds, if you're getting money from the government, you have to be very transparent about how that money is released. Otherwise, most of these kinds of funds are nonprofits or sort of other entities that do have to file public disclosures, but there's not a lot of granular data around how that money is expended. And so I think there it's sort of, it's a challenge. I think figuring out how can I request, communications between agencies that are not exempt and agencies that are exempt to try to get that data. Can you sort of file requests sent from the government to this fund for support or things that were forwarded on for special highlighting? I think you're seeing a lot of weird stuff already, right? We're seeing the stuff with, Bob Kraft and the plane full of masks. And it's like, this is a bizarre way to kind of run an emergency relief. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing because we do need these masks, but this is not a good way to kind of run this. And so I think figuring out, like, there's the whole debate, are these masks even workable in a clinical situation, right? Because this was flown on a private plane on a secretive mission and coordinated in some fashion with a governor who is exempt from public records law, there are a lot of legitimate questions to be asked there. And so I think figuring out sort of how was this coordinated. Most of the the major hospital systems in Massachusetts are private entities, but if they're interfacing with programs that are not, you can sort of sometimes get in that way. But I think even when you have a lot of people trying to do the right thing, you run into problems, you run into grifters. And I think that's one thing after, not related to the One Fund, but we saw a lot of snake oil salespeople come out after the Boston Marathon bombing. We saw a lot of
surveillance. Surveillance state,
the surveillance, right. And best case scenario is complete fraud. Worst case scenario, you've got Clearview, which is but I think it's really important that we go in, we don't take people at their word for sort of the efficacy of their product, whether that's surveillance, whether that's healthcare. And I think particularly small agencies are going to be really vulnerable to scams, to fraud, and then their impulse is to typically cover that up, right? And so I think
we've seen waiving of bidding in a lot of cases.
Right. Yeah. And I think already you're seeing weird political favoritism. You're seeing people get marked up contracts to political, connected organizations that have no prior experience building this stuff, right? And you are seeing a lot of companies who are doing heroic efforts to kind of redo their factory lines to kind of support this effort. But you also see profiteers who are really quietly kind of coming in here, and who knows if what they're doing is actually effective.
Someone had a comment. I don't know what they said. Yeah, mask, the N95 masks do not stop penetration. And this is so let's I'm sure that everybody, if anybody has any questions too, throw them in the Q&A, because I think we're going to wrap up soon. But I'm sure that anybody who watches this now or watches the replay is going to go right to MuckRock and look at some of the requests that have been returned. And if you wanted to just tell us about anything in particular on our way out, and also what any kind of request in particular that you're seeing that can be helpful to multiple individuals and news organizations, not just the one who filed them. So if I'm sitting here thinking I want to file some stuff that could that's not overly broad, but that really could return a few things that could be helpful, not just to my news organization, but to others. What any kind of categories that I should be looking in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've already mentioned a lot of them. I think looking at contracts that are being signed, right? I think looking at schools alone, right? I think figure out if you're a beat reporter or if you're an activist in a certain area, do take a step back and sort of think, how are the areas that you care about or you covered pre-coronavirus being rewritten in the coronavirus age, right? Overnight, thousands and thousands of school districts around the country all of a sudden had to work to remote learning, right? Yeah. And so they're using Zoom and getting Zoom bombed. They're using Google and sort of giving up data to Google in different ways that people don't fully understand. Police department, I think every different area of life is being rewritten just at a speed that is kind of unimaginable. And so I think figuring out what are the areas that we've seen radical change, but that people have been too overwhelmed to even look at. And I think there's lots of really good opportunities. I want a copy of any contract signed within that 30-day period. I want to looking at sort of how has the usage of services gone down or up. I think looking at sort of what are the areas that are sort of one step away from this sort of coronavirus that are worth poking into. One other thing, we didn't get too much into this, and MuckRock doesn't do a whole lot of public meetings stuff, but it's also really important. And this is another area where we're seeing a lot of sort of agencies relax or change their public meetings laws.
Yeah.
And I think this is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge agencies should have been addressed in a non-crisis time, because the internet and online video streaming, that could have been an opportunity for more participation, more accessible participation for years. But instead, now we're seeing agencies have video meetings without proper notice or closing things to the public. And I think, a lot of times I don't think this is fully malicious, but the result is that you're continuing to close access to sort of the public's work. Beryl just did a really good update looking at some of these changes. So I'm just going to drop that link into the chat real quick. So check out that piece that Beryl just put together, looking at some of the changing laws, which agencies have been shutting down, but also sort of, how public meetings have changed, how sort of getting public input has changed, right? I think at this crisis, with public trust so low right now within government, within media, rather than doubling down on secrecy, both government agencies as well as the media need to find ways to be more transparent, need to find ways to make sure that everybody's having their say at the table and being heard. Because otherwise this is something that's going to be really, really hard to rebuild this trust and come back from this, because it's going to be a very long road, and conflicting messaging, misunderstanding this stuff already has caused so much damage, and it's going to take a while to build back from that.
I think unless anybody has any more questions, I think that we've really covered a lot of ground. It's fantastic, and I'm definitely motivated to file some requests, or first to spelunk through what others have done, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think even I consider myself a bastard, and I've even been like not wanting to bother people to a certain degree. And also, of course, there was just so much immediate, like moving shit out of the way to do that, and reporting on the situation on the ground as much as possible, stuff like that. But this stuff is just so critical, now more than ever. And it's a cliche, but I truly believe it right now. Just because, we all, not to just really just even with Trump in office, we've seen so much happen at the local and state level that really kind of goes without seeing. And now just all these other distractions. So thanks a lot. And I don't know if, I guess any information that people need that usually give out about MuckRock as far as,
yeah, I mean, we're staying busy. We're, I think we're trying to do more virtual trainings. This has been great. Thanks so much for the great questions, Chris.
Yep.
And if people want FOIA strategy, that sort of stuff, we have a free Slack that's kind of FOIA experts are in there, kind of helping craft and workshop requests all the time at muckrock.com/Slack. We have instructions there. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. And if anybody has any last questions, they can drop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them, but it doesn't look like there are. So yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Get us the video and we'll put it up, and I appreciate it, man. You'll see some new requests from Binge very soon.
Great. All right. Thanks so much to SPJ for hosting this. SPJ New England's fantastic organization.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, man. I'll talk to you later. Peace. Okay.